Yeah, just a quick welcome for everyone that's tuned in. Thanks for tuning in. I don't have any major announcements from the Sunday school.
I want to talk a little bit about Alexander William Donovan, and I think everybody's fairly familiar with him. He acted for the Saints quite often as a lawyer. He was a lawyer by trade. He was also a higher ranked individual in the militia. He held a commission. And after the surrender of Far West, and we talked about this a little bit on Sunday, General Lucas, who was kind of an interesting piece of work, he was the general who took over, and he was instrumental in having the Saints ejected from Jackson County. So he was not a friend. In any case, after they took charge of the Mormon leaders and instituted kind of a court martial, which was very interesting because the people that they were court martialing were not members of the militia. Anyway, they declared Smith and others guilty of treason and then ordered Donovan to execute them. And then he said this very famous line, "It's cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order. If you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God." And that carried a lot of weight because he was, by profession, a lawyer. And so, of course, General Lucas didn't, and instead they carted them off and began legal proceedings instead of shooting them in this kind of kangaroo court that they had put together. But the other interesting thing that I found was that in that same year, Emma gave birth to a child, and they called him Alexander. And he was born in Far West, Missouri, and was named after Alexander Donovan, who had refused to execute the leaders of the church. I just thought that was a nice little interesting bit of information that I had never pieced together before. And I think everybody's familiar with this particular story. I found this painting, which is called Majesty in Chains. And you remember after they were taken and they were given kind of a preliminary court hearing, and they were held in one of the houses in Richmond, and prior to being sent to Liberty Jail, they were chained together at night, and the guards were saying just filthy things and recounting instances that were just disgusting to what they had done to the women and the children, and it was just terrible. And partly relates to this story that Joseph got up and said, "Silence, ye fiends of the infernal pit. In the name of Jesus Christ, I rebuke you and command you to be still, and I will not live another minute and bear such language. Cease your talk, or you or I die this instant." And then the guards just cower away, and they even apologize. But then I think what was very interesting is what Parley P. Pratt said later, when he said, "I have seen ministers of justice clothed in magisterial robes, criminals arraigned before them while life was suspended on a breath in the courts of England. I have witnessed a Congress in solemn session to give laws to nations, but dignity and majesty I have seen but once, as it stood in chains at midnight in a dungeon in an obscure village of Missouri." I can't ever get through that story without just getting emotional. The things that happened to these gentlemen, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, are amazing. And the transformation that occurs to the people who endured these events is also amazing. And I think I'd like to focus on that more than anything else, plus, of course, the scriptures. But if you look at the scripture reading that we're going to talk about tonight, when you begin in section 121 that says, "O God, where art thou, and where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place?" and so on and so forth, and I think you're familiar with this, you can see the depths to which Joseph is struggling to understand the why and the how long is this going to have to happen. And they're incarcerated for almost 6 months. And during this time, their families are going through troubles. They can't help, and they're kind of trapped, and they can't get out. But when you go all the way to section 123 and you read the last verse, he's talking about, "Dearly beloved brethren, let us cheerfully do all things that lie in our powers, and then may we stand with the utmost assurance to see the salvation of God." So what happens is my question, I guess. What happens between these 3 chapters where he says, "Oh God, where art thou?" until he's talking about cheerfully doing everything? Obviously, something dramatic happened. What happened?
Sections 121 is my favorite section in the Doctrine and Covenants. And like you guys, I've been impressed particularly by Elder Holland's talks over the years about Liberty Jail experience.
He gives an awesome talk, Lessons from Liberty.
Right. And the transformation described of Joseph and Hiram in particular, they came out of that experience even more sanctified and holy, whereas Sidney didn't. I think it broke him. Doctrine and Covenants 121, 122, 123, and Job are not in our scriptures accidentally, because they speak to us and our lives and our trials.
Thank you. I appreciate you expressing your ideas. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific scriptures that are very famous to us, but I want to talk about them in a little different light, from the sense that words are important, because some of the words that are used in these sections are different, very different from what we would use today and how we think of them today. And so I would caution you that as you're reading these scriptures, that you have to realize that 200 years has gone by, and in 200 years, language changes. So if we look at, for example, 41, 42, and 43, that talks about no power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood. And then it goes through. But in particular, I want to look at verse 43 that says, reproving betimes with sharpness, because not only does this have to do with priesthood, but I think this has to do with families and raising kids, and is very applicable to us today. And in particular, I want to look at two words, betimes and sharpness, and talk about what those mean. And I've grabbed the Webster's 1828 dictionary here, which I highly recommend that you have beside you as you are reading the Doctrine and Covenants, because betimes, I think today we think of that as sometimes, but that's not really what it means. It means in good season or in short time, soon. So when we talk about reproving betimes, that means at the right moment, because there's a good time to reprove and there's not a good time to reprove. And if you're angry, I don't think that's a good time to reprove. And then sharpness has taken on a whole new meaning for us today. We think of sharpness like definition number 5, a painful, you're attacking almost. But I would suggest that this particular time, it means meaning number 2, not in a confused way, not obtuse, but rather very sharp in that the image is clear. So you're reproving in a timely manner with clarity so that we don't lose whoever it is that we're trying to help.
Yeah, Carl, this is Nick. I was just going to say, sometimes too that, that goes along when we're raising children, that there is a time when we go to reprove them, you have to do it in that timely manner, like you mentioned with sharpness, it's no good to do it at some time when whatever that incident or something happened and you do it a week later or so. It's not a timely manner, right?
Thank you for your comment. I want to look at another very famous scripture, which is 44 to 46 in the same chapter. And it talks about your bowels being full of charity and letting virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly. And I want to concentrate on these two words, virtue and garnish, because they mean something different today than they did back then. So if we look at the word virtue, today, virtue pertains more or less to chastity and that type of thing. And in that context, this verse loses some of its effectiveness. But if you think of virtue from the idea of 1828, it deals with moral goodness, not just chastity. It had a different meaning back then. And then if you look at the other word, garnish, today garnish has taken on this meaning of, like you have a garnish on your plate or something that offsets it to make it look beautiful. But garnish, I'm going to suggest at this time period, that what the Lord was suggesting was meaning number 3, to furnish or to supply this virtue, this moral virtue. We're not talking just a side dish of chastity here. We're talking about a full-on supply of moral virtue. And when you look at the scripture in that context, let's just go back. Let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly. So we need to be continually supplying our minds, our thoughts with the moral virtue that the Lord is talking about. And that's what gives us the confidence to wax strong in the presence of God and have this priesthood power distill upon us. And so I think words are important. And as we go through and study our scriptures, we can't do this cursory reading like I used to always do, just kind of read through it because I got my chapter done for the day. But we need to take this little bit deeper dive so that we can understand what it is the Lord is trying to teach us.
I think if I can make a comment on the deeper dive, Carl.
Sure.
I've heard it described, I don't know if it's Elder Holland or another speaker or author. I'm not literary qualified, but professors of literature have made comment on this section and the sections you've just been referring to in the 30s and 40s. If you examine them and read them and just look at them for their divinity, their cleverness of language, we can sometimes read, it's like reading the Book of Mormon, and we miss just how correct the language is and how articulate it is, how clever it is.
I appreciate that. I think sometimes we dumb it down, and I think sometimes we go too far. In past generations, I think they took language more serious, and they were really wordsmiths. They really used language in a much more effective way. Today, we almost butcher language, and then we condense it down to 140 characters and drop vowels and do all kinds of interesting things in the language of today. We could spend a whole other hour talking about, for example, the Bible and why it's the King James version that we use and the beauty and the language of it. I appreciate your comment. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about temple prison.
Add something real quick, Carl?
Sure.
It's actually funny because I find these comments really interesting, what you were saying, Brother Fisher, the depth that you can go into with the scriptures. One of my kind of philosophies has always been to keep the gospel very simple. I often can feel overwhelmed by the complexities that there's just so many different things that I need to keep straight and all that. But at the end of the day, I've found a lot of strength in keeping it simple. So this conversation has kind of brought to light in my mind, the importance of not oversimplifying the scriptures. In my mind, when I go into things with this perspective that, the gospel is very simple, that doesn't mean that I should take for granted these scriptures, and that we can really dive into them. And there's like deeper meaning, I guess, that will help us keep the gospel simple, I guess, if that makes sense. So I find it interesting, the contrast where we hear the gospel is quite simple, yet the scriptures are quite deep.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's talk about this temple prison. This idea was first broached by B.H. Roberts, who was a member of the 70, who was a historian a long time ago, and then reinstituted by Elder Neil A. Maxwell, and then most recently by Elder Holland, where they talk about this change that happens in Liberty Jail, and they compare it to a temple-like experience. I think it does just thrill Joseph Smith to the bones to know that 6 miles away from Liberty Jail today stands the Kansas City, Missouri Temple, and that, you can jump on your car and be there in 14 minutes. The Lord used this experience of being in jail to teach Joseph and the other people that were there some very important things. And I think we too, in our extremities and our difficult situations, can turn something very, very challenging and difficult for us to go through into a temple-like experience. And as an example of this, I'm going to present the case of Amanda Barnes Smith. Doesn't she look formidable in this picture? Sister Smith, if you remember, on the journey to Missouri, because they were all asked to go, they happened to be in Hans Mill when the massacre occurs. They just happened to be passing through. And Amanda, her 2 daughters and her son Willard survived, but her husband and her son were both killed. And her youngest son, Alma's hip, was shot away. And I think everybody's pretty familiar with this story. Desperate for help, Amanda prayed and received inspiration on how to create and apply a poultice to the wound. The wound healed, and then this joint miraculously appeared, and Alma made this full recovery. And I think everybody's pretty familiar with this. It's a very famous story. If you're not, it's in the Saints book and you ought to read it. Well, what I want to talk about is what she said afterwards. When she was at her most desperate time, she went out to a cornfield to pray. And she said, and look at the word she's using, it was as the temple of the Lord to me at that moment. I prayed aloud and most fervently. When I emerged from the cornfield, a voice spoke to me. It was a voice as plain as I have ever heard one. It was no silent, strong impression of the Spirit, but a voice repeating a verse of the saints' hymn. The soul who on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not, I cannot desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell shall endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never, no never forsake. From that moment, I had no more fear, and I felt that nothing could hurt me. And I think sometimes we forget how amazing the women were, who were oftentimes left behind when the men went off on missions and got thousands of baptisms, or they went off and did the Lord's work, which I'm not saying they shouldn't do. They did do that, but they were left to hold down the fort, and the Lord helped them and blessed them. But oftentimes these women, I think, have been by history perhaps undervalued. I was just touched this week by how powerful these women were and how strong they had to be. And, you know, this woman, Amanda Smith, was an amazing woman because she carried on all the way to Salt Lake. I want to talk a little bit about what happened in this prison/temple situation and some of the stories of what occurred. General Clark, who was the commanding officer who took over after Far West was surrounded, besieged, and then they surrendered, he said to the people, as for your leaders, do not once think, do not imagine for a moment, do not let it enter your mind that they will be delivered or that you will see their faces again, for their fate is fixed, their die is cast, their doom is sealed. Now, if you're a family in Far West and they've taken away your father, your brother, your husband, and they've said you're never going to see them again, how would you feel? Like, how devastated would you feel? At the same time, we have Joseph Smith receiving this, be of good cheer, brethren. The word of the Lord came to me last night that our lives should be given us, and that whatever we may suffer during this captivity, not one of our lives should be taken. What an amazing statement. Now, this was early on in the captivity. I think this was within the first few weeks when he received this impression. I sincerely doubt that Joseph felt that he would be incarcerated for 6 months. I think he had the feeling that the Lord was going to take care of him, and that's true, but that it maybe was going to be a shorter time period. And so this was a great hardship for these brethren to be trapped and to be sitting with very little to do and time on their hands and considering and thinking and worried about their families, their spouses, their children, the church in general, and how they were faring and what they were doing as they were being chased out of Missouri, and where were they going and who was leading them and how was that working. In effect, Joseph had to lead the church from a prison cell, and they did it by writing letters. And we have, thank goodness, historically, we have 12 letters that Joseph wrote or dictated. And these sections that we're talking about, 121 through 23, are excerpts from two of these letters that were then canonized in the late 1870s and became part of our scriptures. Otherwise, we would have this giant void as far as what happened this year. And from a historical point of view and from a scriptorial point of view, these are amazing things for us to have available to us. In fact, you can go online to the Joseph Smith Papers and read all 12 of the letters and read in context between what happened with these scriptures. And if you had time, I would encourage you to do that. He knew that they would be delivered. He didn't know when, and he didn't know how it was going to happen, but he trusted in the Lord that it would. I would suggest to all of us that in our most difficult times, and I'm not saying that Joseph was always upbeat, because there were times when you read his letters that he was in the depths of despair. But if we trust in the Lord, He will take care of us. Here's another change that I see in Joseph Smith. This is a story that we get from Truman G. Madison. A story is told of an encounter between the prophet Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. In the presence of a rather large group of brethren, the prophet severely chastised Brother Brigham for failing in his duty. Everyone, I suppose, somewhat stunned, waited to see what Brigham's response would be. After all, Brigham, who later became known as the Lion of the Lord, was no shrinking violet by any means. Brigham slowly rose to his feet, and in words that truly reflected his character and his humility, he simply bowed his head and said, "Joseph, what do you want me to do?" The story goes that sobbing, Joseph ran from the podium, threw his arms around Brigham, and said in effect, "You passed, Brother Brigham, you passed." And I think over time, you see that Joseph, who in the very beginning, when he was just learning about the gospel and when he was having these visions, and he was very, very, very cautious about what he said and what he did. But as time goes on, you can see that as he passes through some of these circumstances, and finally, as he gets through liberty, he becomes a different person. He becomes, not that he ever doubted what he saw, but he becomes more bold, more fearless, more willing to do whatever the Lord asks him to do, regardless.
When Joseph was in liberty, he was what, 32, 33? He was the prophet of this little band of saints, but there were powerful men and women like Brigham, like Eliza Snow, like Parley, like Orson, like Heber, like Wilford, powerful, intelligent, strong men and women who would follow this man into fire. And it annoys me sometimes when we have people criticizing Joseph for some of the supposed chinks in his armor. He was a prophet of God, and what he suffered in liberty alone, along with his loyal brother Hiram, again, just gives me a witness. And yet people would call him a charlatan, weak-minded, and all the negative terms, just ridiculous. They didn't know, and members need to study a little bit more that are critical of Joseph, need to study a little bit more of what he did, who followed him, and the signs of truth, nobility, and deity are there clearly right through his whole ministry.
I agree. I thank you very much for that comment. I want to talk a little bit about Know Why. There's a video series called Know Why, and they're numbered. And if you get a chance, I want you to watch this particular one that kind of influenced me this week. And it had to do with the reasons for why Missouri occurred. And we've talked about this before, that it occurred, the difference between the people in Missouri and the members of the church was so dramatic. It was a frontier town versus people who were trying to be more godlike. There was the questions of the politics of the slave versus the not slave state. There was some issues with respect to how we viewed and understood members that were Native American versus how they referred to them. And it was a melting pot of a lot of different situations. But I'm going to add another one into the fire that I've been investigating this week. And it has to do with money. There's a Presbyterian minister and a mob leader named Mr. Woods who is quoted to have said this: the land sales, he said, were coming on. And if they could get the Mormons driven out, they could get all the lands entitled to preemption. If they would join and drive them out, they could get all the lands back again, as well as all the pay they had received for them. He assured the mob that they had nothing to fear from the authorities. It's a very interesting statement and bears some further investigation. The law of the land had changed with the Louisiana Purchase that they had made from France. They had opened up this whole area for people to get land. And so they had recently changed the law that meant that before the land was surveyed, you could buy it for $1.25 an acre. And then you could spend time developing the land and producing and getting money off the land. And then you could use this money to actually purchase the land. You would have the right of first refusal. And it just so happens, coincidentally, that the time for the land to come up for sale was exactly the time when the Missourians drove out the members of the church. In fact, there are 64 leaders that were held for a 2-week period of time that exactly coincides when they would have had to go and claim their land at $1.25 an acre. And these 64 people that were held without bail for a 2-week period of time happened to coincide exactly with when they would have had to go and claim their land. And so instead, the Missourians went in and claimed the land and got it for $1.25, already houses built, businesses secured, everything all ready to go at the cheapest possible price. And then incidentally, right after this, there was a newspaper article in December of 1838. We have many reports here in relation to the conduct of some of the citizens of Davies and other counties as the recent land sales at Lexington. Some of the citizens who have been most active in the excitement against the Mormons purchased a number of the Mormon tracts of land where the Mormons had made settlements and improvements. It is said that these citizens have purchased them for speculation. It is said that the town of Amond Diamond, as you can see, it's mispronounced, a Mormon town in Davies in which there are several houses, a very valuable site for a town, was purchased at these sales for $1.25 an acre. And so you can see we can throw into the mix here this whole economic thing. Some people have speculated now that it was more economic than even political. I don't know. I can't really answer that, but I would recommend that you go to this particular Know Why, number 620, and there's a
heavy persecution.
There's a video there that you can go through and watch that goes and talks about this particular event and what occurred. The Great Escape. I think we need to spend just a few minutes before we run out of time here on how they got out and why they got out. This is all very well documented in the Saints Volume 1, Chapter 33, "O God, where art thou?" And apparently when they finally do, after almost 6 months, get to their trial, the lawyers and a lot of the people that were sitting to judge them were intoxicated. And in fact, even members of the jury, some of them were so intoxicated they couldn't keep them awake. In order to get a fair trial, they requested a change of venue, which was granted. And so then the prisoners set out with a new sheriff and 4 new guards. And these guards were very lenient and treated them very, very nicely, and even let them travel on horses and in the wagons. And they were just nicer people. And there was one instance where Joseph won their respect by beating the strongest of them, who is said to be the best in the county, in a good-natured wrestling match. And this despite the fact that Joseph had been malnutrition for more than 5 months. Because the public opinion was shifting at this time, the Missourians had grown uncomfortable with this extermination order, and they simply wanted this whole thing to be done. And they'd already accomplished what they wanted by getting the land grab, and so they wanted this to go away. The day after they left Davis County and were moving to this new area to be judged, the men stopped at a way station and the prisoners bought them whiskey. That's a whole other conversation that we can have. And that night, the sheriff approached the prisoners and said, "I shall take a good drink of grog and go to bed, and you may do as you have a mind to do." And as the sheriff and 3 of the guards then got drunk, Joseph and his friends saddled 2 horses with the help of the remaining guard and then left and headed east. There's a general feeling that people understood that what was happening was not just. And in fact, there was some concern raised that if in fact we're going to be trying these members of the church for doing something wrong, obviously there's always 2 sides to a story. We should look at and then prosecute the Missourians who did something wrong. And so when that idea came up, then they decided, no, we've just got to let them go. Let's solve this problem. We can't just say we're going to release them, but we'll arrange for them to be released so that this problem can just go away. 2 days later, Joseph and the other prisoners, while they're fleeing to safety. Now, you remember from last week, we talked about the apostles coming in the opposite direction, going to far west. So this is all happening at the same time. While Joseph and those people are fleeing and escaping, the apostles are going to far west because that's where they have to leave to go on their mission to Great Britain. And so they're kind of crossing paths. which is kind of interesting. They finally get over to, they cross the Missouri. And so I want to just read this because I think it's very interesting. Around this time, a ferry landed at Quincy and several rough-looking passengers came ashore. One of them, a pale, thin man, wore a wide-brimmed hat, blue jacket with an upturned collar that concealed his unshaven face. And I think that's kind of interesting because you see some of these paintings that have occurred with these prisoners, and they're all clean shaven and they're all dressed immaculately with the stiff collars. I don't really think it was like that. I think it was like this. His ragged trousers were tucked into worn out boots. Dimmick Huntington, a former sheriff among the Saints in Far West, watched the unkept stranger climb up the bank. Something familiar about the man's face and the way he carried himself caught Dimmick's attention, but he could not say why until he got a better look. "Is it you, Brother Joseph?" he exclaimed. Joseph raised his hand to quiet his friend. "Hush," he said cautiously. "Where is my family?" Still shocked to see the prophet, Dimmick explained that Emma and the children live 4 miles out of town. "Take me to my family as quick as you can," Joseph said. Dimmick and Joseph rode to the Cleveland home, following back streets through the town to avoid being seen. And when they arrived, Joseph dismounted and started for the house. Emma appeared at the door and recognized him immediately. She broke into a run and embraced him halfway to the gate. I'd never heard that story before, but I had imagined that it would have been something like that, where this joyful reunion happened. And then I also found this particular story about his mother. "That night, lying down upon my bed to go to sleep, I saw my sons in vision on the prairie in Missouri. Oh, how pale and faint they looked. I sprang up in bed. 'Oh, Father,' I said, 'I see Joseph and Hiram. They're so weak they can scarcely stand. And now they're lying on the cold ground asleep. Oh, how I want to give them something to eat.' I saw them until they had lain there 2 hours. They traveled on. Hiram rode at this time, and Joseph walked by his side, holding himself up by the stirrup leather. I could see him almost reel with weakness, and yet I could not help him. My soul was grieved." And in later discussions, we find that this vision that Lucy had was exactly what happened. They only had 2 horses between them. And so they, in fact, did what she saw, where one of them would ride and one would hold onto the saddle and just walk along with them. And she said she was so sure of what she saw that she got up in the morning and she started preparing a bunch of food because she knew that they would need food because they would be hungry when they arrived. And that's exactly what happened. My heart goes out to these brilliant, wonderful women who oftentimes were left at home to worry about their men, their sons, their brothers, their husbands, and how difficult that must have been. But the Lord was with them. He blessed them and he helped them and he comforted them. And they went through similar but different trials that obviously had huge impact on them. As we're going to see later, as the year goes on, they're going to go through this again in Nauvoo, and then they're going to have to go out to Utah. And many of these women traveled alone. Now, I was going to share with you before closing this from President Eyring, but instead, I'm going to share with you my notes that I took from State Conference, from President Steele's talk, because I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about, to these trials that these people went through and through the trials that perhaps we go through. These are just my notes I took from the talk on State Conference. Happy people still have problems. I don't know why, but somehow we think that if we're having problems, it's because we're sinning, and that's not true. Not necessarily true. Happiness is a state of mind. Obedience brings happiness. Repentance brings happiness. Forgiveness brings happiness. Service brings happiness. There is joy in the journey. And I'm amazed at how well President Steele's talk went in with our scriptures for this week. I love what he said, that we need to take time to appreciate what the Lord is doing for us. The other thing that I found very, very interesting was the very last section, section 123, where the Lord had everybody write down what had happened for an historical record of all the atrocities that occurred, all the losses that were made, and that these are now documented. Recently, well, not recently, in the 1990s, BYU went through all the documents and created a 1,000-page huge document that collated and put a price tag on how much money was lost and all that occurred. And that's an amazing read too. But I mean, 1,000 pages, you'd need almost a lifetime to get through it all and study it. But the most interesting thing I found is that I'm not a writer. I'm a talker, but I'm not a writer. But I think this process of writing down what happened was not only historically valuable, but it was very therapeutic for those people that went through some very horrendous things. But the idea, the thought that came to me was that having them write it down helped them to pass through it. And I think that maybe has some relevance to us today. In any case, those are my thoughts. Anybody else have anything else to say before I turn it back over to Jesse?
I think that the whole of this is a really good example to us because we all go through our own fires by trial. But I can tell you that I got closer to the Lord during that time than I ever had at any other time in my life, where now I know how he speaks to me. I listen when he speaks to me, and I have become a much stronger person knowing my capabilities. And I think that's why we're constantly given trials. If we don't gain that testimony of steel within ourselves at some point, we're not going to be close enough to him. And I think Joseph's example is the best that we can ever have. When we are down and we cry to the Lord and we plead and we do what he says, he is there and he lifts it up. And I know that.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I think we all have those kinds of experiences where when times get tough, if we go to the Lord, that's when the growth happens.
You know, going back to your last closing comments there, Carl, about, you know, how writing down these things must have been therapeutic for them. I know I definitely have a testimony of that. I do think that it helps us, it forces us to reflect on how it all kind of comes together and why we might be going through it. But thank you everyone for your comments. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully those that are tuning in later can feel the special spirit that we felt and learn some new things. I know I have for sure.